All right, everyone, here we are. Topic 8, elder abuse. Again, before we begin this lecture, as you can probably see on this opening slide, I have included some pictures of actual victims of the crime we'll be discussing today. Not for fun, not for whimsy, but for you to be confronted with what this actually looks like, okay? It gives you I hope that it would give you a deeper appreciation of the actual suffering that these people have to endure. All right, so what is elder abuse? Well, this can be a single act or repeated acts or even lack of action regarding a person that we would consider to be older, right? So, and this is especially when the victim is expecting some form of trust from the offender, right? So it's whenever you inflict suffering or don't take away suffering on a person that is older, and that's most of the time that is either neglectful or deliberate. And there are various forms of this type of abuse, and we're going to go over some of these. That can include psychological abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, financial abuse, and again, that reflects some form of intention or neglect. So when we look at all of the data, so some of the first research that's been conducted was, I think, in the 80s, found that, at any point in time, about less than 10% of elder folks experience some form of victimization within a year's period. And so that was like the first study, and I think that was conducted by Finkelhor. Actually, Finkelhor is a pretty big name in victimology. I've read some of their work in my criminal for serial killing and murder, and obviously general victimology, and then also when you look at child victims. But so they found about less than 10% of people will report some form of victimization in a period of 1 year. And we've seen that those numbers have remained sort of consistent over time. Even existing more recent research will show about 1 out of 10 elderly folks will admit to being victimized in some way or form in a given year. So what are some different types of elder abuse? Well, we can look at physical abuse, just straight up neglect, because some older folks, they need help getting around. Some people's hips might not work, their knees might not work, sitting up, going to the bathroom, stuff like that, they might need help. And so not providing them that help when they are under your care is neglect, and that is a form of abuse. Sexual abuse is something that occurs to older folks. And then also psychological and financial abuse. Right now, this graphic is from a study that was conducted, I think, in the early 2000s. And it sort of shows you the overall spread of these types of abuse. Now, it doesn't include sexual abuse in there, but it gives you a good example of sort of how much is psychological and how much is financial and physical. And financial abuse is actually growing. And I was talking to a prosecutor the other day who deals just with elder crimes against the elderly. And they said that during the COVID-19 pandemic, they realized so much fraud being conducted, so many people targeting older folks for identity theft and trying to commit sort of cyber crimes to get at their money. Like these calls you might get, something that are like, the Social Security Administration needs you to pay $5,000 or otherwise an agent will be coming to your house to arrest you, right? Those types of like phishing calls or whatever you would call them, they are aimed at people who are not as savvy with what's going on in the world today, and that includes some of the older folks. And as such, you get a lot of financial crimes being committed against them. And so what this prosecutor was telling me is that during the COVID-19 pandemic, it just skyrocketed, like it got out of hand. And so their explanation for it was, now this is anecdotal, it's not research, proven, it's anecdotal, okay? This is one prosecutor who deals with crimes against older folks in a large city in New York, said to me that they think that during the pandemic, because it was difficult to go commit crimes outside, it was easier to focus more on these cyber attacks, and as such, it yielded more crimes against the elderly. So how would we define these types of elder abuse? Well, physical abuse is any act of violence that is intentional, that inflicts some sort of pain on the person, right? So this can be, hitting somebody, misusing communication, medication, misusing physical restraints, or just forcefully confining someone, right? Abuse that is in physical nature. It's pretty straightforward. Neglect is intentional or unintentional, a failure to care for someone, right? Especially when they're so old that they can't control their bowel movements and stuff like that, and you're aware that they've soiled themselves and you don't do anything about it. That is intentional neglect, right? And also when you're just not paying attention to them and they're putting themselves in a situation where they can, where some form of fistula or infection or something can occur, right? That is your fault, especially if you are in that, if you have taken on the role as caregiver. And then sexual abuse is any sort of sexual activity that is not consensual, right? If someone does not consent to it, that is sexual abuse, even if they consent to it and then revoke that consent, right? That is sexual abuse. Psychological abuse is any sort of means to dehumanize someone, to make them feel any sort of verbal violence towards someone. It can also be non-verbal acts, like not like listening to what they're saying, like not recognizing what they're saying, purposefully misinterpreting what they're saying, right? Abandoning, lying to them, right? And then financial manipulation or exploitation, using, because the thing with the elderly folks, especially those that are retired, some of them have a lot of money, right, that they've saved up for their entire lives, right? And so by trying to extort that money from them or stealing it from them through fraudulent means, stealing their identities, opening up credit lines, all that type of stuff, any sort of financial misdeeds or nefariousness, it would be considered financial abuse, and that is a big issue. And sometimes you see this a lot, with the kids. The adult children of these elderly will take advantage of that. Now, any of these types of abuse that we just discussed can occur in myriad contexts or settings or situations, right? It can be a form of intimate partner violence, right? So happening between spouses. It can also be abuse by adult children or relatives. It can also be institutionally based abuse. So this is when you are in an old folks home or retirement home. I have a friend who runs a retirement home in Virginia that specializes in dementia and Alzheimer's patients, or it can be some form of sexual assault. And so we're going to look at some of these types of situations for the remainder of this video. So when it comes to spousal abuse, it's quite interesting because a lot of the older folks today, right, were people who got married and, you know, fell in love and you know, went through that whole hoopla before the feminist movement. And so some of the contexts that we see today might be alien to some of us who have not lived in that time. You might sort of think it's sort of irrational or crazy even. And which is another thing that's also interesting is seeing how this might change in the future as more generations become elderly and then are victimized, and seeing whether these trends change as a consequence of the feminist movement. So those are all interesting things that I'm look forward to seeing. But nonetheless, we find that about 58% of perpetrators of elderly sexual abuse were their intimate partners. So what that means is that spousal rape occurs a lot in an elderly setting. Older women are more likely to be killed by their spouses than men, and the problem is with all of this is that the reason why women especially are so much more open to spousal abuse, is because, again, like I mentioned, it's the pre-feminist factor. And as a consequence, right, these women have never lived alone before because they had always been so dependent on men as a consequence of patriarchy. And also might not have learned any of these skills to be independent as they, were courting in the 50s and 60s. So then abuse by adult children. So in some of these cases, it's a situation that we refer to as role reversal, right? So what happens is that, and again, this is especially still relevant for today's older folks that, before this whole movement of stop beating your kids became a thing, right? Like I grew up in the 80s and 90s and I received many beatings as a child. But now in today's world, like with my kid, I am never going to set touch my kid, in a way to discipline them, right? That has completely changed over time as science has shown us, oh, wait, when you beat your kids, sure, you might get some short-term compliance because you've beat them into submission, but now you're going to give them anxiety and depression when they're older, right? And so what we see is that with some abuse that occurs by adult children, it's this role reversal situation where because of the older folks not being able to take care, the lack of autonomy, not being able to take care of themselves, not being able to be competent, maybe being a bit slower, and therefore it's kind of like, oh, the tables have turned. And to be honest, I grew up in a situation where my relationship with my dad was interesting, in that he wasn't very emotionally aware when I was young, and he would often get irritated with me as I was learning things. I'd try something. I remember, for instance, the first time I ever tried to ride a bike without training wheels on. The first thing I did was I fell, and he immediately called me an idiot, right? And so I find myself today, now that he's older, and it takes him a while to freaking understand what I'm trying to say to him, I find myself getting extremely irritated, right? And then when I meditate on why I just got irritated with my elderly dad, I realize, there's these subconscious feelings of like, no, F you. You were irritated, by me when I was just trying to ride my bike, or when I was trying to shine a flashlight on whatever the hell you wanted me to shine on. And now you can't even understand when I tell you to look in that cupboard. Now I'm not gonna hit my dad because I'm better than that, but still, it's the same rage that resurfaces, right? And so in our studying of these adult children abuse situations, we found that there's type 1 abuse is when the adult child is dependent on the victim for financial assistance, right? And so in this situation, the adult child will take advantage of the fact that the victim has money, has a house, has stuff, and so they will then either through financial exploitation victimize the person, or there might even be physical or psychological abuse, right? Using psychological tactics in order to gain additional resources or to maintain their situation. Type 2 is a caregiving type of situation where the victim, the elderly victim, is now dependent on the child. Maybe they live with the child, and the child, still has to go to work. They still have their own children. They have their own things that they're stressed about. And now, elderly mom or dad can't even go to the bathroom without needing them. They can't take care of themselves. They might have dementia and keep on forgetting things. They might have Alzheimer's and become aggressive when they have episodes of remembering things or forgetting things. And now the stressed out caregiver becomes verbally abusive, or maybe even physically abusive, or neglectful, purposely neglectful, right? And especially at that age, right? At the age where your parents are old, you have young children who are just as needy, right? So you have an old person who's needy, you have a young person who's needy, your husband or wife, that's when your marriage is like 15 years old, right? So you have all kinds of baggage that you're juggling, and your job at this point, when you're 15, 16 years into your new job, right? You're given more responsibility. So a lot of pressure falls on these 40 to 45-year-old to 50-year-old folks, right? And now if you have to deal with a freaking parent who has dementia or Alzheimer's, right? That can be very stressful. So even though it's absolutely inappropriate and it doesn't justify it, right? It occurs. And I remember, especially, with Alzheimer's and dementia, it runs in my family, and it's something that, I saw my grandmother struggle with. And I remember my dad, again, he's not very, he's not emotionally intelligent, but I will say he's very practical. I remember when my grandmother started getting really, really bad, she wouldn't even remember who we were. It was sad to see. And so what would happen often is she would remember who my dad was all the time, right? And so my dad would receive these calls, and she'd be like, I don't know where I am. I don't know what day it is. I don't know what year it is. I don't even know if I have a husband and stuff like that. And my grandfather at that time had been dead for like 10 years. I remember my dad went over to my grandmother's house, and he threw away every single newspaper and magazine that was more than 1 week old. Because what had happened was, my grandmother would, she'd get mail, she'd get bills, she'd get whatever, she'd get magazines and newspapers and just coupon books and stuff delivered to her house or to her apartment, and she lived in this assisted living apartment complex, and people wouldn't take care of that stuff, right? So she would she'd become lucid during after an episode of her dementia, and she wouldn't know where she was or who or what day it was, right? And it was scary. And so she would call my dad and freak out. And so, I remember going over there with my dad, and he's not emotionally intelligent, so he didn't really explain to me what he was doing. So I just see him start throwing away stuff, and I was like, what the hell is the matter with you? And so then he was like, but if she freaking, if she sees all these dates that aren't corresponding, she's not going to know when she is. And I was like, oh, okay, yeah, that makes a lot of sense, right? The sad thing is that my uncle at the time was living just down the road from my grandmother. He never thought to do that while we were living in the United States, 5,000 miles away. It might even be more. I don't even know how many thousand miles South Africa is from the U.S. But it's, we flew out there, took care of business. It's something that my uncle could have done, but, whatever. But yeah, so the point of me telling you that is that the stressors that are put on this type 2 situation are even more intense when it's Alzheimer's and dementia, because sometimes folks with dementia, and I have a friend again that runs a whole assisted living situation, a building that focuses just on Alzheimer's and dementia, and he says these folks can get pretty violent sometimes, right? Because if you're snapping in and out of what you can remember, right? I could see myself getting quite aggressive. You might not know when you're being victimized, right? When are you fighting, standing up for yourself, and when, when are you just taking out the rage of not knowing who you are or what's going on, or where you are, or why you're here? Why is someone walking you down a hallway? Why is someone pushing you down a hallway that you have no memory of into a room you don't even remember? I don't know. I might get violent, right? So in these caregiving situations, it adds quite a lot of stress. And while it's never appropriate, obviously, to be abusive to elderly folks or anyone, right, it makes sense why it occurs. It's not that these people are 100% irrational. So if you look on Blackboard, I posted a video of a British documentary style show on elder abuse in institutional settings. I implore you to watch that. It's quite eye-opening. So in some cases, when you cannot take care of your elderly parent in your own home, you send them to institutions where they can receive the care they need. And so we refer to these as long-term care facilities, right? The long-term care facilities, assisted living, all those things are there. And there's a wide array of them. There's ones that are more like hospital-like, and there are others that are more like my grandmother. She lived pretty much in an apartment complex where there was just she still could cook and get her own food, but there were people who were on campus there, just checking on them every now and then, making sure they're all good, but she could come and go as she pleased. But these people in these institutional settings are quite vulnerable, right? They don't have their own family with them. They are in a setting where they're completely dependent on these institutions. And there is not that, we can get really into the weeds with this, but the people who are taking care of these folks aren't necessarily well qualified or well paid, right? Yeah, you have some registered nurses on there, they're getting well paid, but all of the people doing the day-to-day interaction, these are people getting paid hourly wages that aren't a lot, right? This is America after all, right? And so we've noticed that about 36% of nurses and or nurse aides have reported having seen at least one incident of physical abuse perpetrated by a staff member at these places, right? That is more than a third, okay? That is a lot. And then some people, about 10% have actually admitted flat out that they have committed some form of physical abuse, while almost half have said that they have been involved in some form of psychological abuse, right? And you're in the situation, again, and it's similar to the type 2 situation where these people don't have, these staff members, they don't have this personal relationship with the victims, right? And so when someone soils themselves, when someone is mean, when someone is having a bout of dementia where they're in and out of what they can remember, and they get aggressive, right? There is less social control that is stopping you from acting out in a way that is abusive. And what makes matters worse, and this is one thing my friend was telling me, right, is that what happens is some of these older folks, right, are in their 90s, they're in their 80s. They grew up in a time where people were racist and people were outwardly racist, right? Especially in the South, where my friend is. And so now you have a Hispanic, or you have an Asian or black caregiver, right, staff member, who now has to endure a bunch of racial slurs from this person who just soiled themselves, and you're cleaning them up, and then they're calling you names that would get someone that would get a normal person fired from their job and shunned by their profession. So it's not, I mean, look, again, we're not victim blaming here. We're not saying that, oh, these people bring it upon themselves, but it makes sense, right? It makes sense why it occurs, and it's unfortunate that it occurs, and yeah, I mean, it's tough, right? It's tough, and it highlights the fact that we as a nation don't put enough resources in the elderly, right? We don't put enough resources into them. And it's only going to get worse because the baby boomer generation is now moving into this position, and that's the largest group of elderly folks we've seen in modern times. And it's only going to grow, maybe until the Gen Z folks are there, but I might not be around then. But anyways, so one thing I want to talk about here, and I don't have a slide for this, is elder sexual abuse. Okay, and we're gonna go over these 4 types of rapists that have been identified by Burgess in 2007, or Burgess and colleagues in 2007, regarding elderly sexual abuse. Okay, so most of these offenders are men, and they and the sexual abuse ranges from actual rape that involves penetration to sexual assault, any sort of unwanted sexual contact. Okay, sorry. What Burgess did is they identified 4 types of elder rapists, right? So the first is the opportunistic rapist, right? And so they are just very impulsive people who don't have any sort of social awareness or interpersonal skills. So this is just an impulse. It's not because of fantasy or anything, and they would be involved in all types of other impulsive behaviors. They would likely not have many friends, not be able to maintain social relationships because they just don't give a crap about other people. Everything is just about them, and it's very short term. And this comprises about 13% of elderly rapists, right? So these are people, there's no planning, no preparation. There's usually a history of weird, unsocialized behavior where the rape just serves as an example of the degree to which the rapist lacks interpersonal skills. And this is about 13% of these types of rapists. Then the pervasive anger rapist is about 22% of people, right? And they like to use gratuitous or excessive force, all right? The violence for them is not integrated into the sexual experience for them. The rape is more a part of the violence, right? They just want to be violent to someone. And so the rape is sort of like a secondary, or the sexual abuse is sort of a secondary thing that comes from it, right? The more the victim resists, the more the aggression will increase, and this is often how it leads to death. And again, this is violence to them is something that they direct in a sexual and asexual way, meaning they'll be violent towards people to whom they don't have a sexual affinity to. So let's say they're a heterosexual male, they'll be violent to other males and females, and no matter who they are, they're just violent people. And in this case, the sexual part of this abuse is just a secondary aspect of the violence, right? And this comprises about 22% of elder rapists. Then you get your sexual type of rapists, and these are people who, this comprises 40% of elder rapists, and this is where the sexual motivation is the primary factor here, right? So there's planning involved. They usually have pornography and other types of paraphilias that they're into that are similar to this type of abuse. You'll typically, if you raid their homes, you'll find an abnormal amount of X-rated stuff. You'll see them going to strip clubs, going to massage parlors. So this is they will be, when you go, like if you were to arrest them and then search their house, you would not be surprised with the amount of sexual paraphernalia they have with them. And the sexual rapists can really be broken into three types of sections. And so two of them are sadistic rapists. And so these are rapists who get sexual gratification from the fact that they are hurting someone when they're raping them, okay, or sexually abusing them. So your overtly sadistic rapists, they appear to be angry and belligerent people who, except for their sadism and their planning of the event, right, seem to be very similar to your pervasive anger rapists, right? So the only difference between them and the anger rapists is that they plan this, and they're getting sexual satisfaction from being overtly aggressive to this person. Then your muted sadistic rapists, they're the ones who also get a lot of arousal from the fear and the discomfort that the victim feels. However, the amount of physical force and assault that they exhibit is proportionate to the amount that they need to get victim compliance, right? So they will only use the necessary amount of force and assault in order to get the victim to stop resisting, essentially. These people will also be less likely to hurt the victim when it comes to the sexual aspect of things, right? They're more just there to, like, they still enjoy the fact that the victim feels fear, but it's more measured and it's more mitigated. Then you get your non-sadistic rapists, and these are the people who would so they're the people who think, right? And so you have this these are the people who might initiate sexual abuse, thinking that, oh, once I have started sexual activity with this person, they will actually enjoy it, and then it'll become consensual, right? So these people typically suffer from these distorted beliefs about women and their sexual experiences. They believe that, oh, once I start having sex with them, they will actually enjoy it and it won't be a big deal, right? So these people will typically, when they realize there is a lot of resistance, they might completely abandon the sexual assault and just get out of there. Then your vindictive types of rapists, so they make up about 21% of elder rapists. These are people who only target women, okay? So they are the pervasive anger rapists, right? They will be violent towards anyone, okay? But these vindictive rapists focus only on degrading women through rape, okay? So they like to humiliate them, and it only focuses on women as the targets. And this misogynistic anger event during these assaults will range anywhere from verbal abuse to a brutal murder that could be a consequence of the rape, right? They differ from the pervasive anger rapists in that they show minimal anger towards men and only focus on women. All right. I know that was a little heavy, how we ended there, but I felt it was important to cover this. Yeah, I mean it's never comfortable talking about these things. But anyways, so if you have any questions, if you have any concerns, you know how to reach me. Comment in the videos if you want, or just shoot me an email. Other than that, chill vibes.